I want to talk about a really bad experience I had when I was looking after someone's dog. It's not the first time something like this has happened to me, but it's the worst. I started dog sitting when I was 13 years old, and I was earning a good income. I often posted about dog sitting on Facebook and Instagram, and people would message me and ask if I could take care of their dogs. One day I got a message on Facebook that my wife and I are going to Florida for a week, and we need a dog sitter. I need you to watch my dog from the 4th to the 11th of this month. You can stay with us, or you can go back to your home. I talked to this guy. I'll call him Mr. Brown for privacy. I agreed to take on the task and told him I would be staying at his house for a week. I told him about the dog's routine, what happens at home, special instructions, and other details. When I arrived at his house, he introduced me to his 2 dogs, Mina and Letty. Mina was a small Yorkie, and Letty was a blue hound. Mina was a small Yorkie, and Letty was a blue hound. He showed me around the house, which is 76 acres. I live in a farm town, and my house is on 32 acres. My closest neighbor is quite a distance away, so if I wanted to talk to her, I had to drive there. Some rules were explained to me, and Mrs. Brown told me about a woman who lived nearby. She said that this lady was a kind person, but that she was sometimes distracted and confused. She also said that this lady sometimes accidentally came their way instead of her way. She also said that sometimes she mistook Mrs. Brown for her dead daughter. I really felt sorry for him when I heard this story. I understand how difficult it is for parents to lose their children, because my family had a very difficult time when my brother died in a car accident. Mrs. Brown said she did nothing wrong, but if she comes to my house, I can tell her to go back to her own house, and she will leave without any problem. After they left, I was ready to watch a movie or relax with the dogs. The first 2 days were fine. There were no problems. But on the 3rd day, an old woman, let's call her Rose, pulled into the driveway. When she tried to get out of her car, so did I. As soon as she saw me, she got back in her car and drove away. When she saw me, she realized she had gone into the wrong house and thought she was going back in. That evening, Mrs. Brown called me. I said yes, and asked her why she was asking me this. She then told me that Mrs. Rose had phoned to say that the house had been burgled. When I told Mrs. Brown what had happened, she laughed and said that Mrs. Rose must have been confused and forgot that we were not at home. I went there the next day and ended the call with the intention of dispelling the delusion that I was the burglar, but things changed when I went to bed that night. Around 2 a.m., I was awakened by a slight rattling noise outside my window. At first I ignored it, thinking it was a bird or something, but the noise made it hard for me to sleep again. I got up and tried to open the blinds to get rid of the noise, but when I opened the blinds, Mrs. Rose was trying to open the window with a pair of pliers. As soon as she saw me, she started banging on the window with the pliers. The dog started barking. I told the dog to come with me, and I grabbed my cell phone and ran to the bathroom. I locked the door just in case. I called 911, explained the situation, and gave them as many addresses as I could remember. They told me the police would be there in about 10 minutes. I kept the dog quiet and put him in the closet next to the bathroom so he couldn't hear me. I tried to stay calm, but I could hear him banging on the glass while I kept talking to the operator. Then I heard the sound of breaking glass. Now I was really scared, almost crying because I was afraid of being hurt by someone who was not in his right mind. After 4 minutes of almost no sound, I heard footsteps and saw feet under the other side of the door. Then I saw Mr. Rose kneeling down, lowering his hands and looking through the gap in the door. I let out an involuntary breath. He started banging on the door more often, and I could see he was using pliers. I was already crying, and I was asking the operator where the police were. She said 3 minutes, but those 3 minutes seemed like an eternity. I yelled at Mrs. Rose to go away, and she yelled at me that I shouldn't be here. I heard a police car, and a minute later they were trying to break down the door. And finally they came in. I yelled to get their attention. He was still banging on the door. When they entered the room, he was told to drop his gun. He listened and said he had done nothing wrong. They handcuffed him, and the police officer told me I could unlock the door, so I slowly stood up and opened the door. After I went to the police station and told them what happened for the report, I went to my parents' house because I was afraid to be alone. The next day, I called Mr. Brown and told him what had happened. He said I couldn't go back home, and he paid the money in full. About 2 years ago, when I was 15 years old, my family and I moved to a new apartment. We decided to get a puppy. We walked him 4 or 5 times a day, but it was hard to leave him alone. For the first few weeks, I thought it must be hard for the neighbors because he barked and cried when we weren't home. But when we talked to our neighbors, they told us not to worry. Except for Tony, I hardly heard any moaning, and everyone was fine. One Saturday, I was home alone when someone knocked on the door. When I opened the door, Tony was surprised at first, but smiled politely and said, I'm sorry. I said okay, and he left. My parents came home and I told them what Tony and I had talked about. My father went to Tony's apartment because he thought our dog was barking too much. Tony told my father that our dog was barking too much and that he worked at night and needed to sleep during the day. He asked if we could try to reduce the noise, but he understood that it was difficult to control the dog's barking. Tony also said he was sorry that he had come to the door because he didn't know I was home alone. My father said he had a pleasant and polite conversation with Tony. Dad apologized for the inconvenience, and when he came back, we did what we could to ease the puppy's anxiety. It really worked. The dog was still barking, but not as upset as before. Now, fast forward a few weeks. Whenever my dog noticed Tony coming down the stairs of our apartment, he would get very excited. My dog usually likes people for some reason, but he didn't like Tony at all. Tony stopped talking to us and mostly ignored us when we saw him. Sometimes he would just look at us. One day my mom and I came home and found 6 holes in the door of our apartment, as if someone had punched them with a key or something sharp. For the months we lived there, my mother thought we must have done it by mistake. Then my neighbor Martha called me. She was worried about me. She asked if I was home alone that afternoon. Martha said no. Martha then told me that someone was banging on the door, kicking and shouting a lot of bad things. I was so scared that my 11-year-old son hid under his bed for 4 hours until Martha came home. He thought someone was trying to break in. A few weeks later, there was a city festival at night, and my family, Martha's family, and I went to the festival. We came back early, around 11 o'clock. Around midnight, someone rang the doorbell. My father went to see who it was, but nobody said anything. Usually, in such cases, he looks out the window or goes downstairs to see who it is, because it is usually the postman. But because it was midnight, my father thought it was really strange, and he didn't go downstairs. He mostly ignored it, and we all went to bed. But the next morning, my mom talked to Martha. She said that when she came back from the festival, Tony was hiding under the stairs with a stick in his hand. He looked very nervous and said someone had rung the doorbell late at night. So I went downstairs with the stick to check. My mother knew immediately what had happened. Tony rang our doorbell, and I thought Dad was going to go down and see who it was. I don't know if his plan was to hurt Dad, but Dad was very angry because he wasn't home during the week, and he was worried about Mom and my safety, so he went upstairs and knocked on Tony's door. But when Tony saw my dad, believe me, he almost fainted. My dad talked to him, and Tony really started crying. He told my dad that sometimes he did drugs and he didn't really know what he was doing. Then he apologized for damaging the door with his pocket knife, and for the night before. He didn't even try to lie. Every time my dog felt Tony's presence, he would get angry because Tony was waiting for everyone in the building to go to work. Then he would come to my door and kick the door. Every time he did that, my dog got angrier and angrier. My father calmly said, "If you ever come near my family or look at us again, I will tell you in no uncertain terms. Do you understand?" The man kept crying and tried to hug my father. I went to the police and reported the damage, but I never saw Tony again. Eventually, his wife kicked him out of the house and got a restraining order against him and his daughter. One morning, she woke up to find him staring at her and her sleeping daughter. The whole house smelled of gas because he had left the stove on. We moved out soon after and never saw Tony again.